Hello, and welcome to the Complete Analyst. This video is designed to give you a good working definition for strategy. It's part of our What Is series defining common terms that many analysts need to work with. Now, I'm not claiming that this is the only correct definition you can use, but perhaps this one will make your life as an analyst just a little bit easier. So why should you care? At first, this sounds like a silly question because the answer may seem obvious to you. You might reply that you care because strategy is important. Well, that may be true, but until you start to actually define one with your colleagues, it may not be apparent just how many different and somewhat complex definitions of strategy each of us may be carrying around in our heads. If you've ever spent a day with your colleagues around a whiteboard or hunched over a PowerPoint presentation trying to formulate and articulate a strategy, you know how difficult, confusing, and even contentious this can be. So what does the world have to offer that will help us? Well, even a cursory examination will reveal a vast amount of material available on the topic of strategy, taken from different angles and addressing different strategy domains, such as corporate strategy, IT strategy, HR strategy, business unit strategy, and many, many others. If you're interested in these topics, I do encourage you to explore them further and take the time to read some leading books if you can, and build up as much background knowledge as your time and interest level allows. I've put some links to these resources in the video notes. Now, to be clear, I'm also not taking a position as to which approaches work best, because that, of course, depends on your situation. However, I do think that all of these approaches have one thing in common that can help you address strategy in your role as an analyst, whether you're involved in formulating a strategy or just trying to understand it. Put simply, I'll assert that a good working definition of a strategy for an analyst is, at its core, about choosing a course of action from a set of reasonable alternatives. This applies to strategies at all levels, from high-end corporate strategy down to the strategy you may choose tomorrow to solve some thorny operational issue that you're dealing with. There are two things to remember here. First, strategy is a choice. You are picking one course of action over another. If you can't name the other alternatives and explain why they were not chosen, then you probably aren't engaged in strategy. Second, the other alternatives must be reasonable. If the alternatives sound like nonsense or they're just too far-fetched, then you likely are not engaged in strategy either. It's also important not to get intimidated. Strategy doesn't have to be some high-end boardroom issue reserved for senior executives. It can be very local and practical. I'll use a simple example here to illustrate. Let's say your goal is to get to your best friend's house across town. You could walk, you could ride your bike, you could drive, or you could buy a helicopter, get a pilot's license, and fly there. The first three are clearly reasonable alternatives, but the fourth is clearly not, unless you're a billionaire. So you weigh up the alternatives, and then you choose to ride your bike. That's your strategy to reach the goal. And next, you move on to planning and execution. As an analyst, you'll run into these types of choices all the time. It could be a business model strategy, a product distribution strategy, a sourcing strategy, a talent acquisition strategy, or whatever. The main thing is to ask is whether the course of action chosen has reasonable alternatives that were adequately considered. If not, then you are likely dealing with something other than a strategy. In that case, you might start asking some questions. Now, here's another case where something is stated as a strategy, but really isn't one. Do you see the problem here? What is the reasonable alternative to this statement? To not invest in our people? Now, you could probably imagine a strategy that intentionally brings people on board, makes zero investment in training, workspaces, or employee well-being, and just works them until they expire. But that seems pretty unlikely. At a minimum, the statement of strategy should be closely questioned. Usually in cases like this, it's just a motherhood or aspirational statement dressed up as a strategy with the best of intentions and probably not a lot of thought. So I'm just sharing this example here as something you should watch out for. Real examples can be helpful, so here's a common business strategy example you may have heard of before. The book, Discipline of Market Leaders, lays out a choice between three distinct value disciplines an enterprise may choose and argues that while every organization must meet minimum threshold to compete with all three, it must choose one as its primary emphasis. Probably the most famous example of this is Apple, which clearly has chosen product leadership, and we all know the story from there. So maybe you might want to take a moment now to think of some other examples that resonate with you and the organizations you work with today. So as an analyst, how will you use all of this? First of all, I would say that context matters. In the course of your work, you're going to be encountering a wide array of so-called models, plans, and frameworks within the context of these types of topics. Many of these things will go through a life cycle where more detail is being added over time. The first of these is usually strategy. After that, there will be additional things like visions, analysis, plans, architectures, designs, and so on. So it's pretty likely that you'll hear the word strategy in the context of these other things. Again, it's not just a senior executive thing. All of us will encounter strategy concerns in our work as analysts. In closing, my message is, I think, quite straightforward. A strategy chooses a course of action from a set of reasonable alternatives. This should be true regardless of the approach you took to arrive at your strategy. If you think of it that way in your role as an analyst, perhaps it might simplify this topic, take away some of the mystery, and enable you to be more effective in addressing matters of strategy. I hope you have found this video useful for you. Look in the links below for more related videos and other resources that explore this and other adjacent topics. Thanks for watching.